Today, we are very honored to host this panel on the ongoing negotiations between Iran and major world powers about Iran's nuclear program, of course. And the discussion of the panel will be mostly around the framework agreement, as many of you may know, it was reached earlier in April, and all the talks about it, and also the challenges to reach a final agreement by the June 30th deadline. One of the good things about living in Boston area, I would say, is that there is no lack of experts on a variety of topics, and including the topics of our panel, so they're very honored today to have an esteemed panel. I don't want to keep you waiting for too long, but I will give a brief introduction about the background. I'm going to start with Dr. Arnold, who is an assistant professor at Perry College and an associate of the project on managing the atom at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, Wilker Center. Dr. Arnold has spent 9 years as a consultant to the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice, where he focused primarily on arbitration, financing, and illicit procurement networks. He's currently working on a project that looks at the broader social, political, economical consequences of sanctions. His recent article titled "Free Myth" about the Iranian sanctions, published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, critiques much of the commentary and debate about lifting Iranian sanctions. And he's holding a PhD from George Mason University's School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs. Our next guest, Dr. Jim Walsh, is a research associate at MIT Security Studies Program. Dr. Walsh's research and writing focus on international security and in particular topics involving nuclear weapons and terrorism. Dr. Walsh has testified before the United States Senate on the issue of nuclear terrorism and Iran's nuclear program specifically. He has numerous, articles and appearances on the national and international media outlets. And before coming to MIT, Dr. Walsh was executive director of the Managing the Atom project, again at our neighbor university, Harvard, John F. Kennedy's School of Government, and also a visiting scholar at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And I'm proud to say he also holds a PhD from MIT. Our next guest, Dr. Payam Mohseni, is the Iran Project Director and Fellow for Iranian Studies at Harvard Kennedy School's Wilker Center for Science and International Affairs. He is also a lecturer in the comparative politics in the Department of Government, again at Harvard, where he teaches Iranian and Middle Eastern politics. And he's also the co-chair of the Eastern Mediterranean and Europe Study Group, if I'm not mistaken, at Harvard Center for European Studies. Dr. Mohseni's research focuses on the internal policymaking process of the Iranian state, the dynamics of factional politics in post-revolutionary Iran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. Dr. Mohseni received his PhD in government from Georgetown University. Last but not least, we have Farzan Sabet, who is a PhD candidate in the international history at the Graduate Institute of Geneva, coming all the way from Europe, or actually he's visiting in the Department of Government at Georgetown University for a couple of months. And I just want to add that he's also the managing editor at IranPolitik, with K.com, a website on Iranian domestic politics and foreign policy. Without further ado, Farzan after me will start with a brief introduction of the current, basically knowledge or state of negotiations to facilitate the discussion that will be followed by the panelists. So please all join me in welcoming them to our campus and to this event.
Thank you, Priya, but I don't know how brief I'm going to be, but I'll try. We're going to take a relatively in-depth look at the status of negotiations and what has been achieved so far, and what the outstanding issues could potentially become an obstacle to a final agreement. So first of all, what is the dispute about the Iranian nuclear crisis, as some call it? Iran, essentially this is a dispute between Iran and the P5+1, and some of the P5+1 being the United Nations Security Council 5, permanent 5 members, plus Germany. From Iran's perspective, the dispute is about being able to benefit from what it believes to be its right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to use nuclear technology, including uranium enrichment and the full fuel cycle, for the purposes, for peaceful purposes, including energy production. For the P5+1, especially its Western members, concerns that Iran does or has had in the past had the intention and a program to build nuclear weapons are at the heart of this crisis. The essence of the issue is that nuclear technologies, many of them, especially uranium enrichment and reprocessing, are inherently dual use. They have both peaceful and military applications. So one of the main questions in these negotiations has become, how can Iran benefit from the peaceful use of nuclear technology, specifically the fuel cycle, within the NPT, while allaying the fears of the number of states that is not pursuing nuclear weapons? Within this kind of penumbra of nuclear issues, there's a number of set issues which I'm going to go through, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of them in greater depth. So, how many centrifuges which are used to enrich uranium can Iran possess? Can it do research to build more advanced, more efficient centrifuges? To what percentage of uranium can it enrich? Can it enrich up to 90%, which is weapons grade, or can it only enrich up to the level of 3.5%, which is for the production of fuel? How large a stockpile of enriched uranium can Iran possess within its soil? Can Iran keep the IR-40 heavy water reactor, or Iraq, which would enable Iran to produce enough plutonium over time, or what's known as the plutonium path to the bomb? And finally, can Iran keep open the Florida fuel enrichment plan, which, because it's hardened against conventional military attack, many believe would be the site of an Iranian nuclear breakout? These sub-issues, this set of sub-issues specifically, are connected to the concept of breakout, or how quickly could Iran produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a single nuclear weapon. The idea is that if Iran's nuclear program is restricted enough, the breakout time would become long enough, say 1 year, which is the figure that's thrown around in the current negotiations, for those concerned states to create a response that would stop an Iranian dash for the bomb. A second set of sub-issues related to Iran's peaceful use of nuclear technology are linked to being able to verify any final agreement. So you can have an agreement, but if you can't verify that the other side is complying with this agreement, then it may very well not be worth the paper it's written on. And within this, so how intrusive inspections can be carried out on Iran's declared nuclear sites, as well as non-nuclear facilities, which could potentially be the site of undeclared nuclear activities. Can IAEA inspectors go anywhere, anytime in Iran, or will they be much more restricted? And to what extent does Iran have to account for past alleged military dimensions of its nuclear program, or what's called PMDs? These sub-issues are linked to the concept of sneakout, which tries to basically address concern by some that even if Iran agreed to restrictions on its nuclear program, it could secretly continue to carry out restricted activities, including nuclear weaponization, research, and work. Finally, the third kind of big block of issues, which is really important, are kind of economic sanctions. So the P5+1 basically believes that sanctions are what brought Iran to the table. So it wants to basically keep them for as long as possible, whereas Iran wants them lifted relatively quickly. So which sanctions are going to be lifted during the current negotiations, and how fast will the pacing of the sanctions really be? So what's been agreed to so far in the framework agreement, the joint statement, a JCPOA, or whatever you want to call it, at least based on the very simple text that we have from Mohseni and the Foreign Minister Zarif at their press conference, it seems that a few issues have at least been clarified. So it specifically mentioned the joint statement of Foreign Minister Zarif and Mohseni explicitly mentions Iranian enrichment under a final kind of JCPOA, with its enrichment capacity, level, and stockpile being limited for a specific duration and only at the Natanz fuel enrichment plant. Iran will be allowed to conduct centrifuge R&D, so it will be allowed to conduct research in building more advanced and efficient centrifuges. But it will carry out on a scope and schedule that is mutually agreed upon. So that will be, again, restricted to mutual agreement by the two sides. Fordo will not enrich, but it's going to be kept open and converted to a nuclear physics technology center, which will contain uninstalled centrifuges but no fissile material. So it's one of those creative ways they try to get around the issue of the sensitivity towards keeping Fordo open in Iran. The Iraq reactor will be redesigned, rebuilt, and modernized with the help of an international joint venture such that it will not produce weapons-grade plutonium. Iran will accept measures under the oversight of the IAEA, including provisionally the additional protocol, and the IAEA will have enhanced access for basically looking not only at current issues but past issues as well, which may very well be referring to the key of these issues. On the sanctions side, they're going to try to ensure that there's a comprehensive lifting of all sanctions, so that wording is kind of in there, with the European Union terminating the implementation of all nuclear sanctions, while the U.S. will cease the application. And finally, the UNSC nuclear-related, so Security Council nuclear-related sanctions would be eliminated. And a new UN Security Council resolution will endorse JCPOA. So it seems on paper that a lot of the issues are being addressed or clarified, but actually, practically, I think the very day of the agreement, it seems that differences were already emerging. So Professor Walsh, you've looked a lot at the kind of U.S. side of things and the U.S. faction. At least on the UN side, where are some of the discrepancies you see?
This seems like a really loud mic. Is it? It is. Help me, technical man. You can probably do I need to be recorded? Is this being recorded, so you need this? Yeah, I got it. Okay. First of all, it's good to see all of you this evening. Thanks for coming out. I'm indebted to our sponsors to create the space to be able to have this conversation, and I'm honored to be with these distinguished panelists. Let me ask two quick questions just to get a sense of who my audience is. How many of you have seen me speak before? Anyone? Okay. Well, let's do that. And not enough to matter, but I'm sorry. And also, how many of you know, and there's no wrong answer here, know what the letters JPOA stand for? Okay. Good. So that sort of tells us a little bit about where people are at. I want to talk about the agreement, but I think, the tendency, and how much time do I have, my friend? How many?
For the initial 10 minutes. 10 minutes?
Okay. I always like to time myself. I don't trust myself. I'm not reliable, but this will keep me honest. So, I know the tendency is to jump right into this complicated agreement and talk about the number of centrifuges and the enrichment levels and breakout and sneak out and all the rest. I think it's better to begin by stepping back and asking ourselves, what do we know about Iran's nuclear status? That's the place to start. And so the top intelligence official in the United States, the DNI, has repeatedly testified before Congress that Iran once had a nuclear weapons program, had it in the late 1990s, halted it in 2003. That they have a basic weapons capability. They know how to build a centrifuge. They built 19,000 of them. So you can't bomb that knowledge out of their heads. If they were determined and willing, as the Pakistanis said, to eat grass, they could do that if they wanted to. But they have, as of yet, not decided to build nuclear weapons. The DNI is quite specific about this, that Iran has not decided whether to pursue nuclear weapons. I underline this because it stands in stark contrast to what probably the ideas that many of you have in your heads. Not all of you, but many. Because I think the media and the Congress and the public subscribe to this set of propositions. The policy objective here is to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapons capability. We have to stop that. You hear people say that all the time. What does the DNI say? He says they already have a nuclear weapons capability. That horse is out of the barn. So that's not what this is about. And the public believes that Iran has an active nuclear weapons program right now. And the DNI says, no, that's not true. That was halted in 2003. And the Congress and the public and the media believe that Iran is pursuing the bomb actively, and this is probably inevitable. And the top official, intelligence official in the United States has repeatedly said, no, they haven't decided, and it remains to be seen. So before we leap to what do they do if they cheat, which is sort of the question that dominates all this, maybe it's good to start with where they're at, which is they haven't decided the nuclear future. And if this were a rush to the bomb, they're not really doing a great job, because their program started in the mid-1980s. Some years have passed. And since 2003, it's sort of an odd thing to think to yourself, I'm just about to join this nuclear agreement. I could have built a nuclear weapon from 2003 to 2015. I had 10 years to do that if I wanted to do it. And I didn't do it. But now I'm going to join an intrusive agreement and then build one. I don't know if that really makes sense. That doesn't seem to add up to me. Now, are breakout, sneakout, and all the rest legitimate concerns? Of course they are. In all non-proliferation agreements and arms control agreements, you always worry about what the other side might do in the future. But you also, when you're going forward, I can think of 1,000 things that might go wrong, 1,000 things that people might do. I can think of 1,000 things that could hurt me. I'll be hit by a meteor. I'll be hit by a car. I will embarrass myself in front of a group of people. All those things are possible. But I don't live my life worried about all of them. Why? Because I associate each of these things with a probability. Is this likely to happen, or is this not likely to happen? And so it's not enough if you are wondering about the agreement to say, well, this could happen and that could happen. You need to think through what are the challenges here. So one set of challenges is that Iran could break out or sneak out, and I can talk about that. Another set of challenges that is not discussed whatsoever is, what can we do to make the agreement sustainable? Right? There are two sides. If you're a really good policymaker, you should be thinking about two things. One, how do I minimize the risk of breakdown? How do I maximize the risk, maximize the likelihood of sustainability and success? No one ever talks about the latter. Right? And ultimately, that's going to be what's most important. Because if this agreement does not deliver for Iran, or it doesn't deliver for the United States and the P5+1, then they're going to walk away. It doesn't matter what's written in the agreement. If the agreement does not meet the needs of the parties, is a voluntarily negotiated agreement, then the agreement people will walk away. And I can tell you the Iranians are just as nervous about us not fulfilling our commitments with regard to sanctions relief and other issues, as we are concerned that they won't implement their obligations. But again, it's just worth, before we say how many centrifuges can dance on the head of a pin, we should ask ourselves, what is the situation here? And have this grounded in reality. Now, as we break out and sneak out very briefly, again, it seems odd that a country would join a treaty that has enhanced inspection, and that would be cheap, but whatever, maybe that's going to happen. And so, I always want to say that you want to compare this option against the alternatives. So right now we have an interim agreement. If the negotiations collapse, that goes away. That interim agreement prohibits 20% enrichment and provides some expanded verification. Under the comprehensive agreement, I think the President is right. This will be the most intrusive multilaterally negotiated agreement in nuclear history. If you look at the NPT, the most successful nuclear agreement in the world ever, the NPT doesn't even have an enforcement clause. I don't know that this current U.S. Congress would actually ratify the NPT, given today, rather than 1970. They can't pass a treaty for disabled veterans. I wondered if they would be able to pass this, and yet that turned out to be arguably the most consequential action on the nuclear age ever. So this agreement is actually a little more robust than that in terms of its what it requires. And I think if Iran breaks out, that would be a very foolish thing. In other words, if they kick out all the inspectors, that'll trigger the world response, and they'll be saying to the world, we've decided to walk away. The other alternative is that they might sneak out, build clandestine facilities. And I must say, our record of knowing about their clandestine facilities is very, very good. We knew about the ones that they had kept hidden. It is the most watched country on earth, After the agreement, I sort of think that Israel's going to continue to spy on Iran, and I think Saudi Arabia is going to continue to spy on Iran, and the U.S. is going to continue to spy on Iran, and Russia is going to continue to spy. So I don't really see that as a problem. But in any case, should they choose to do so, there's a year's time for breakout. What does breakout mean? People think it means, oh, you'll have a bomb. That's what it means to breakout. That is not what it means. That's not what it means. The definition of breakout is the time it takes for a country, once deciding to do so, to produce one bomb's worth of material, one significant quantity of either highly enriched uranium or plutonium. So you have a softball-sized lump of HEU. You can throw that at someone, but that is not a nuclear weapon. So then you have to go and take that and manufacture it into a nuclear weapon. Now, of course, if you manufacture it into a nuclear weapon and you test it, then you don't have any fissile material left over. So it's really not a good measure of how much time one has. You know, it's probably more like, oh, well, this is going to have 1 year of breakout. What that really means is it would take 2 or 3 years from the point at which Iran decided to get a nuclear weapon, which it has not decided and seems unlikely to decide in the near term. It would still take them 3 years. That's more than enough time, even for Congress, to deal with that problem. Sneakout is when they build clandestine facilities, but one of the great things about having a nuclear agreement, particularly ones that are intrusive, inspectors running around. Right now, the interim agreement resulted in a doubling of IAEA inspectors. I assume a comprehensive agreement would be more than that. And so, as I say, we have a great record of finding clandestine facilities. But the thing is, when you have the greater the transparency, the harder it is to have clandestine facilities. And one of the great things about the way this works is mostly what this functions as is deterrence. A target country is reluctant to do things if it knows it's going to be caught. No one wants to be caught. And so when you have inspectors running around the country, and you have new powers to look up the supply chain at centrifuge production facilities, at the uranium mines, that goes on for 25 years, well, then you probably, it's hard to make, if there's a bomb advocate, it's hard for that person to win their argument because they're going to get caught. So in any case, having an agreement in place increases your ability to detect sneak out. But if there's no agreement, there's no sneak out because there's no agreement. It's unconstrained. They can build what they want. So that's sort of your choice. You want an unconstrained Iran that's where everything is totally dark, right? Where there's no sneak out because they are not under any obligations. Or do you want an agreement that not only confirms that a country is abiding by its obligations, but makes it hard for it to think about breaking them? So I think the provisions, I agree with the President that the provisions here are robust, and especially in comparative terms, if you compare them over history to other like agreements. And I think when you step back and look at where we are in general with respect to Iran's nuclear program, this represents an opportunity. I hate to say the word never, but it's sort of close to now or never. When we failed to get an agreement in 2005, Iran went from 164 centrifuges to 19,000. So if we fail in 2015, what does that look like? I know it doesn't look good. So I will stop there.
Well, I guess one of the other questions is that, before we can worry about breakout or sneak out, we have to kind of get to the deal first. But it seems that over some of the very basic issues, the White House fact sheet diverges from what some of the others have been saying and is much more specific than, for example, what we have in the joint statement.
I think that that's true. Zarif tweeted after Lausanne, essentially a snarky comment saying we don't need any fact sheets. Why? Because it complicates, because the fact sheet represents an American point of view. Then hardliners in Iran read that, and then they go and they whack Zarif with that. I had dinner with the foreign minister in the ambassador's residence in New York on Thursday for 2.5 hours. I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think people believe there's going to be an agreement. Now, the differences that erupted after the competing fact sheets partly reflected the fact that each side was telling exactly the same story in different words to suit its domestic audience. So if you're the U.S., you say, on Iraq reactor, we're destroying the core and we're rebuilding it so it won't be a plutonium threat. If you're Iran, you take exactly that same set of facts and say, we're getting a modern new reactor and we are not giving up the Iraq facility. And both things are true. So I think, obviously, the difficulties will be sequencing over sanctions relief and probably how to handle R&D as centrifuges. I think they may have actually moved on the former, on the latter. On the former, the reality is sanctions, and you can speak to this better than I can, are going to take time. There's no such thing as, even if we wanted to, sanctions will not be relieved immediately. So they're going to find language, because just as a practical matter, it's going to take lawyers time to do this. So they might be able to be removed rhetorically to satisfy Iran's needs, and then their actual dismantlement will accompany a different time frame. I think reasonable diplomats can probably work that out.
So Dr. Mohseni, what can you tell us about the, Iranian reaction to the joint statement between Israel and kind of the state of affairs on Iran in Iran today?
Thank you, Farzan. Thank you, Korea. Thank you for inviting me to talk here today on the Iranian perspective of the nuclear agreement. It's wonderful to be here with Jim and Arnold discussing this debate. So let me begin by kind of describing the Iranian position on this, because the Iranian narrative is very different, very different from the U.S. narrative going into the negotiations. So from Iran's perspective, the whole nuclear agreement is a manufactured crisis. It's a crisis that is impeding Iran's scientific advancement. It's impeding its political independence. And you can see kind of relations and interlinkages with the narrative of, the oil nationalization under Dr. Sabet in the 1950s. So from the Iranian perspective, this is really much about showing Iranian political will, independence, and gaining recognition of its nuclear program and its scientific advancement and capabilities. And that's one important reason why many Iranians, irrespective of political ideology and affiliation in Iran, are very supportive of Iran's nuclear program. So it really goes beyond, just normal politics or even positions on the Islamic Republic per se. It's a more national cause. But what Iran wants from this nuclear agreement itself are mostly two things. And the first is sanctions relief, or just the removal of sanctions. Now, I don't agree that sanctions brought Iran to the table. I'll describe what impact I think sanctions have had on the nuclear negotiations from the Iranian perspective. But one is basically the removal of sanctions, and the second is gaining recognition and normalization of Iran's nuclear rights, or basically normalizing Iran's use of nuclear technology according to international law, and gaining recognition of that use. So one of the things that this agreement does is exactly that. That after however many years, whether it's 10 years, 15 years, Iran's nuclear case will be completely normalized. Right? So that is a significant win for Iran, perhaps even more significant, or just as significant as the sanctions win that Iran can gain once sanctions have been lifted, however that may take place. But to understand the role of sanctions and to understand how this nuclear agreement has advanced as it has so far, we need to really understand Iranian domestic politics. And we need to understand the Iranian factional scene within Iran. So one of the roles and impacts that sanctions had was not necessarily crippling the Iranian economy and bringing the regime to its needs, but really fragmenting and factionalizing the conservative bloc, or the principalists. Right? So that the impact of sanctions was to really hurt many of the core conservatives who really wanted access to SWIFT, access to international markets, people with influence in the bazaar and the conservative clergy. So that type of fragmentation that had already begun in 2009 with the aftermath of the elections really intensified and cemented with the imposition of international sanctions 2011 onwards. That new fragmentation of the conservative bloc created a realignment within the Iranian domestic political scene that brought a consensus around the Rouhani figure, the current president, Hassan Rouhani, a moderate, who created a broad coalition of diverse political voices and positions across conservatives, moderates, and reformists. So there was a variance in terms of economic position, foreign policy position, domestic, religious, or conservative position. There's variance behind the Rouhani position, but they're all united in that they want the nuclear negotiations to succeed and sanctions to be removed. And that's very significant, not just how in understanding the incentives Iran has in being so serious about accomplishing such a deal, but it's important to understand how this coalition is allowing the supreme leader to restrain those marginal voices who are opposed to this deal. But also it's setting the stage of the type of conflict and political disagreements that can ensue once the sanctions are lifted. Because that broad coalition of diverse voices that is behind Rouhani will immediately crumble once sanctions are lifted, and other types of political, economic, foreign policy, etc. divergencies that have always existed will come to the fore again. But the factual issue of whether, why the hardliners would support the agreement, why is the supreme leader allowing Rouhani to win? I mean, a lot of this has to do with the political architecture of the regime and the position of the supreme leader. I mean, the supreme leader does give an important amount of independence and impetus to any president in power. So he is giving Rouhani a free hand, relative free hand, in making a nuclear agreement with the P5+1. But of course, he's hedging his bets. He's making sure that he clearly reiterates his suspicions of the agreement, his suspicions of the U.S., and if the deal were to fail or not be reached, he could say, I was right all along. So he's hedging his bet, and even if a deal is made, he can say, I have supported President Rouhani and the foreign ministry in pursuing such an agreement, right? And to continue to say, but there are discrepancies and differences that we'll have to solve in the long term. Again, setting the stage for political disagreements between hardliners and moderates once a deal has been reached. But given the Iranian faction, so once the April 2nd agreement or declaration or whatever you want to call it, once that was declared, Iran immediately released a summary, or what you say, an Iranian fact sheet. But technically, Iran doesn't have a fact sheet. It's a summary of the agreement that was immediately released that not necessarily differs from the U.S. one, but it emphasizes different things. And really emphasizes those things that Iran has gained, such as its recognition, such as the most important difference is sanctions. That all sanctions will be immediately removed. And this is one thing I actually was in a meeting with Foreign Minister Zarif last Thursday as well. He clearly said that the U.S. fact sheet is wrong, and that this was issued for U.S. domestic local consumption. And once you see the final agreement come out, you will fully see that the U.S. fact sheet is wrong. And I guess it goes back to this issue of sanctions, most of all. And then the military inspections, which we can talk about later, perhaps is a secondary dimension and an important side of difference as well. Now, what happens if a nuclear agreement is reached? Now, this is also important, and what makes these nuclear negotiations very significant is that it has multiple levels of implications. It has implications for Iranian domestic politics. It has implications for regional politics. It could have implications for U.S. Iran relations, for U.S. Iran detente. So one of the reasons from the U.S. perspective or the Western perspective, really the Iranian nuclear negotiations is a security issue. It's an issue of non-proliferation and an issue of making sure Iran doesn't acquire nuclear weapons. But from the Iranian perspective, it's really a larger political issue. A political issue of what this will mean for Iran in the Middle East, what this will mean for Iranian politics domestically, and Iran's role. So it's really not so much as a security issue for Iran. And in terms of its narrative, again, Iran never discusses this concept of a breakout time. It's always the minimum that Iran needs for an industrial scale nuclear energy production. So Iranians don't like it to be measured in terms of how many months or years it takes to acquire a nuclear weapon, because the discourse does not even revolve around the issue of nuclear weapons. And this is because of Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's fatwa that says nuclear weapons is would be banned and haram, forbidden on Islam. So in the Iranian domestic discourse, there's never a discussion of weapons. It's only about energy, and the way to measure how many centrifuges or different capacities and installations are necessary, that's assessed by industrial scale capacity, which again, because of Iran's limited technology, depends on how many years before it can advance that capacity. Again, allowing Iranians to say why we can pause it for 10, 15 years.
Thanks for that great, very in-depth look at the Iranian perspective. So now Dr. Arnold will tell us about the next most complicated issue, which is sanctions for them. So what are they? Right. What are they composed of, and why is it so complicated to lift them?
Right. Thank you. Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight. I've been asked to provide this kind of summary of Iranian sanctions in about 15 minutes in an assessment of how the U.S. tends to kind of disentangle its rat's nest of a sanctions regime. And so I guess we'll see where we get. Hopefully I'll cover all the necessary bases. But what I want to do is I'm going to kind of provide kind of a high-level overview of the kind of three primary pillars in the sanctions regime against Iran: UN, EU, and U.S. sanctions. Some of the key distinguishing features between each of those sets of sanctions, and then again, finally, just an assessment of the challenges that the U.S. is going to face in providing sanctions relief. Now, just to give you kind of a high-level timeline of sanctions in general. Iran has been under U.S. unilateral sanctions since about 1979. Okay. Right. And these have been for a various number of reasons: humanitarian, terrorism. It wasn't really until 1996 it began being linked with Iran's nuclear program. In 2006, the UN sanctions began to come online, and then by 2010, this was when the most restrictive, isolating sanctions began to be imposed against Iran by the U.S. and EU, kind of as a concerted effort to really isolate Iran's energy, financial, shipping, and insurance sectors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the UN sanctions. And lucky for you, I'm not going to kind of give you a chapter and verse of each UN Security Council resolution. It makes for good four-bed reading. But generally, these are comprised, the UN sanctions regime is comprised of four Security Council resolutions: 1737, 1747, 1803, and 1929. And essentially, they progressively target Iran's financial, energy, commercial, and shipping sectors with entities that are related to Iran's nuclear and missile program. Now, when it comes to lifting the UN sanctions, and actually the same with the EU, and I'll mention this in a minute, it's relatively easy for the most part. I mean, as Jim kind of mentioned before, there's some timescale issues. But comparatively, these are not so much problematic. Now, what is somewhat problematic is that the vast majority of the UN sanctions are targeted. But there are some activity-based sanctions, including compelling member states to take vigilant measures in the financial sector. And so what's going to happen to these? I'm not quite sure. Presumably, it'll be an important component of a verification and monitoring regime. But that's kind of on the table as to what will happen. The EU sanctions, these are largely reflective of the UN Security Council resolutions. They're made up, again, of 4 council decisions beginning in 2010. They effectively ban arms sales, prohibit financial services to Iran's uranium mining industry, ban the sale of equipment to Iran's petroleum and refining industries, ban sales of items, dual-use items that are on the missile technology control regime and the nuclear supplier group lists, and they put into place several bans that freeze assets associated with the IRGC. There's kind of two features that really distinguish the EU sanctions from the UN sanctions. The first being that whereas the UN sanctions really only focus on Iran's nuclear ambitions and its missile system, the EU sanctions focus on those as well as humanitarian issues. And they have imposed an oil embargo for importing Iranian oil to EU countries. And I should say it's also very important to mention that it's within the EU that in 2012, I think, that the EU negotiated with Belgian-based financial services messaging company SWIFT. They provide the financial messaging services for everyone, really. Negotiated an Iranian ban. Okay, this is pretty significant. Again, it really isolated Iran. In terms of lifting EU sanctions, again, not too many obstacles, with the exception of those that are related to humanitarian, as well as entities, individuals associated with the IRGC. So this comes down to the U.S. sanctions, and these are unwieldy, complex, a rat's nest of loosely connected executive orders and legislative enactments. To kind of get a sense of how we got to the current state of sanctions, it's important to kind of begin with IEPA, right? The International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And what this does is allows the president to exercise authority to block, freeze transactions, assets, in a state of emergency. And almost all legislative enactments, executive orders refer back to, are rooted in this IEPA. Okay, I'll refer to it as IEPA. Now, generally the pattern has been, right, is that the president will, through a series of executive orders, block or freeze property belonging to entities associated with government Iran, whether it's terrorism or nuclear or missile or humanitarian. And then Congress will kind of come behind and codify those executive orders in legislation, in a sense limiting the president's authority to lift or enact sanctions. And then the president will go ahead and issue more executive orders. And this has kind of been the pattern. And what this really shows then, this is what we're in now, is this power struggle of who has the authority to impose and lift sanctions. So what I want to do is just kind of touch on the core components, the core legislative components, and just one or two of the executive orders that are important in this regime. The first, the Iran Sanctions Act of 1996, that targets Iran's energy sector, linking sanctions to the nuclear, missile, and terrorism. The next kind of biggest piece of legislation was the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Investment Act of 2011. This legislation actually builds on the UN Security Council resolution expanding the sectoral sanctions against Iran's energy sector. It also includes the bulk of the financial restrictions against Iran, which are enforced through OFAC's regulations and the Code of Federal Regulations. And then it also includes the extraterritorial provisions, and this is important, essentially targeting foreign institutions, foreign institutions that basically conduct business with sanctioned Iranian entities. Now, to date, right, that was enacted in 2011. To date, only one foreign financial institution has been sanctioned subject to these kind of secondary or extraterritorial provisions, and that was Bank of Kunlun in China. The National Defense Authorization Act in 2012, what this did, this is kind of interesting, this actually codified Iran's designation as a primary area of money laundering concern. Okay, so prior in 2011, the Department of Treasury, under Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, said Iran is a state sponsor of terror, and their country primary money laundering is concerned. And this requires a substantial number of additional compliance measures. And so this was then codified under the National Defense Authorization Act. And then finally, in 2012, we have the Iran Threat Reduction Act, which amends some prior legislation, as well as targeting Iran's shipping and insurance industries, and codifies another executive order, which blocks all the property of government Iran and Iranian financial institutions. Let me just mention, I have a few here, I don't want to go too far in. No. The latest executive order was 13645 in 2013. This targeted Iran's currency market, and Executive Order 13622 in 2012, which targeted foreign institutions that conduct business with Iran's energy sector. All right, so if that's not complicated enough, I'll just briefly note that about 24 U.S. states have their own divestment acts on the books. Okay. Now, those are really probably have no real consequence in terms of an agreement. Now,
sorry, is that this divestment of state entities in any Iran-related entities, or every one of the state has to divest?
So it varies considerably.
Okay.
Some are just state, and some include state as well as businesses registered in that state. Yeah. So I want to kind of conclude with really three challenges to the U.S. providing sanctions relief. The first is really disentangling proliferation-related sanctions from terrorism, humanitarian, and ballistic missile sanctions. Last month, Treasury Secretary Liu kind of underscored these challenges in remarks to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he noted that the U.S. is committed to maintaining its sanctions, its terrorism and humanitarian-related sanctions, and those won't go away. The second challenge, I believe, would be the sequencing of sanctions relief with Iranian compliance. Clearly, Iran wants sanctions relief quickly, and as Jim mentioned, this may not necessarily be quick and dry. For the most part, the president has the authority to waive or almost all of the sanctions on a 6 to 12 month basis. So you have to kind of reauthorize these waivers every 6 to 12 months. And those address some of the most punishing sectoral sanctions. Okay, but I want to mention that most of the financial sanctions, all right, will likely stay in place. And that's primarily due to Iran's designation as a primary area of money laundering concern. So banks, the Central Bank of Iran, Sadarat, Mali, Sabet, Dadurat will likely still remain under U.S. sanctions. And then third, retain the capacity to snap back sanctions in a meaningful way. Should there be cheating, it will pose a significant challenge. Now, again, from a technical perspective, this isn't really a problem. I think with the real problem is that the argument that the sanctions have been built over the better part of a decade, and that it would be nearly impossible to kind of recreate these sanctions in such a short period of time. I think that argument, against this idea of snapback sanctions, there is some credence, but I think it tends to overestimate the reality in terms of Iran's return to economic normalcy. And I think that process is going to be far slower than most anticipate. Thank you.
Thank you for your very in-depth analysis. So now we'll open the floor to the audience for Q&A. We won't circulate the mic, so speak loudly. Just using ground rules. State your name, affiliation, one question per person, and please keep it short and sweet.